life as hundreds and thousands of South Africans stream into the city to chase their piece of the golden dream. Thanks to a vibrant revitalization effort over the past couple of years, the Johannesburg CBD is the vital center of life for the many who study, work, and play there. And now, Clinics' First Day Hospital is right in the heart of the CBD to help sustain and enhance that life.
So Clinics has got the longest history in the country of providing a platform for black people to be able to deliver care in the private sector. And our oldest hospital in the group, Dr. S.K. Maseko, has been doing this since 1985, and we have got a great experience, and we have got a large network of specialists across our facilities who are highly skilled in the different disciplines of medicine. We are really in a very good position to be able to make those skills and expertise available to the communities and the people who work and live in and around the Joburg CBD.
For more than 30 years, the Clinics Group has been striving to identify opportunities and meaningful ways to pay tribute to our founding fathers who epitomized the concept of black excellence from the start. And it is in tribute to these visionaries that this hospital is named after the astute businessman and legal expert, Dr. G.M. Bike.
Dr. Piche was, to me, he was very, very special. From the home front, he was my father's best friend. And there would never be any important occasion happening at home without Dr. Piche being there. So he's always been there. At some stage in my life, I went through difficult times. He was there for me. You know, when I went through my difficult times, he was there to listen to me. When he went through his difficult times, when he had cancer, I was there to look after him. So I've got that special relationship with him. He's a community leader to me. He's my father to me. He's everything. The founding fathers, like him, is Dr. Piche, but actually he was a lawyer. Okay. Dr. Ntato Motlala was a doctor, but a businessman. Dr. Mukhesi was a doctor, visionary, a businessman as well. In whatever they did, they were quite diverse. Possibly, if you look into his contribution in law, you'll find that it's major. He was the first president of Black Lawyers Association. If you went into education, you will find that he also features in education. So they were a special breed of people that worked across their disciplines.
The Dr. G.M. Bike Day Hospital at 56 Van Willig Street in the heart of Joburg offers healthcare services in dentistry, dermatology, optometry, ophthalmology, physiotherapy, audiology, ear, nose and throat surgery, orthopedics, gynecology, pediatrics, maxillofacial surgery, as well as general elective surgery. The 36 beds in the state-of-the-art wards and private rooms provide a safe and comfortable space for patients to recover from same-day surgeries under expert supervision. The facility also offers doctor's suites for consultations with GPs and specialists for all who work and live in the city. For the convenience of all its patients, the Dr. G.M. Bike Day Hospital offers safe and secure parking and the use of a courtesy shuttle service for patients who need to be transported between other clinics facilities.
You know, the business of clinics has always been to take care of the previously, historically underprivileged people. And we know that our city centers are full of such people. Our city centers are now full of people from outside our borders, from Africa, the north of where we are. And those people have had that, they haven't had that, the privilege of having the facility like the Clinics Day Hospital that is coming up now. So this is going to be a fantastic service for all of them. And we hope that people will see the advantage of being serviced close to where they are. I think that's the whole idea of clinics, to serve people closest to where they live.
It is this ethos of excellence that provides a haven of healthcare for the denizens of Africa's busiest city. The Dr. G.M. Day Hospital at 56 Van Willig Street in the heart of Jozi is open to all every day of the week from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. and welcomes all medical aids. And it serves as a fitting memorial to a remarkable man who dedicated his life to excellence.
Thank you for the wonderful clip, Kamo, and welcome, colleagues. It's a great pleasure to welcome you once more to our weekly webinars here at Clinics Health Group. We've been hosting this webinar since the beginning of the lockdown in 2020, when we couldn't meet physically to the various places of employment or in healthcare centers, and we found this a valuable tool to communicate with all colleagues and the community. And it has been a success, I must say, since we started. And the fact that most of you are coming back every week makes that impression quite real for us, that this is a platform that we can use to interact with colleagues from various fields within the medical disciplines. And we are glad that you found this very useful. And we try our best to bring you cutting-edge medical information and research that we can get from colleagues who are in their various fields practicing and doing research work, some academics and others clinicians. And we are glad that they are able to come and join us at no cost. And Clinics also provides the service at no cost. And so tonight we are glad to welcome such an accomplished researcher and lecturer and academic. Professor Muzi Maseko will be talking to us much later on. But just as a reminder that these are CPD accredited webinars, and we hope that when you connected online, you submitted all your information, so that at the end of the webinar, we can be able to send you the CPD points for those who are especially registered with the Health Professions Council of South Africa. Because if that is the case, you don't have to do anything, just submit your details and we will log in your information, and the certificate will then be uploaded with the HPCSA, where you get your CPD points. But others who are not a part of the HPCSA, we know that you should submit your information, and we hope that you do get your attendance certificates. And also know that these webinars are recorded live on YouTube. And so if you miss the recording or the presentation, or one of your colleagues misses the presentation because of one reason or the other, they can always go back to YouTube and just like us on YouTube, and you will get notifications about the presentations every week. And so we also request that as we do the presentations, the speaker will do the presentation. We'll give them about 40-45 minutes to do the presentation. At the end of that, we'll have a Q&A session. You are free to ask any question that you may have based on the presentation that has been made, or if you've got something similar to the topic, you may ask Professor Maseko that question. And but also request that you mute yourself, switch off your videos, so that we enhance the quality of the presentation, and also because we know that there's load shedding, and sometimes that affects us quite a lot. But all the better if we switch off the webinar because of the presentation. But tonight it's a great pleasure to welcome once more in our midst Professor Muzi Maseko, who is as I indicated, is a lecturer at Wits Medical School, just not far from where you saw the video clip of our latest facilities, the Dr. G.M. Day Hospital, which is based in the CBD, where it's just down the road in Parktown. That's where Professor Maseko is based. He's a physiologist. He has a BSc honors and also Master's in Science in Medicine, and also a PhD in physiology. And as I said, he's currently employed as the Associate Professor in the School of Physiology at Wits Medical School, where he lectures with both undergraduate and postgraduate students at the Faculty of Health Sciences. And he's also part of the development committee that works at the university, established the Human Nutrition Research Laboratory, where he supervises a number of MSc and PhD students. And the research focuses on this laboratory and talks about nutrition. I think he also loves healthy lifestyle and also cardiovascular disease, because if you don't eat well, you may end up with cardiovascular disease. He's involved in a number of research projects, and also he's a member of some associations as the chairperson of the Physiology Transformation Committee at Wits, and also his research and accomplishments are recognized internationally as a member of the American Heart Association, and has been invited to serve as a reviewer in high impact American journals like Circulation and Hypertension, where he was also invited by the University of Leuven in Belgium to work on the collaborative research that they are working on there. On African continent is also quite involved there, serving as president of the Physiology Society of Southern Africa, an organization that promotes research on the African continent. Besides his research and teaching activities, Professor Maseko is also involved in social justice as the chairperson of the Physiology Transformation Committee and other entities within our communities that I will not mention. But it's a pleasure to welcome you, Professor Maseko. On this topic, I was saying to him, is giving us a very provocative topic, talking about the masked central hypertension, the most dangerous hypertension phenotype in South Africa. I'm looking forward to hearing more about this type of hypertension, but as a researcher, he's got a lot to share with us. So sit back and let's welcome Professor Maseko.
Thank you, Dr. Bila, for that introduction. I'm really humbled to be requested to share my research findings with all of you, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm sure we are all going to benefit even from the discussions that are going to ensue from this. Indeed, I just want to provoke you about this hypertension. I've called the most dangerous hypertension, and you'll find out why. You may not agree with me, but I'm going to convince you that we need to start diagnosing this type of hypertension. Let me share my presentation. I hope we can all see it. I think maybe we can just start by asking, what is masked central hypertension? Well, from the word masked, you can get that it's hidden. It's not something that can be easily diagnosed. And then central means this hypertension happens centrally, not peripherally.
Just a minute, Prof. Can you ask colleagues to just mute themselves when you log in? Also, if you could do the slideshow, Prof.
Then?
Slide presentation, if you go to slide presentation.
Okay. Is my presentation not visible?
It is visible, but it's not showing us a slideshow.
Okay.
Yeah, sure, that's fine. It's great.
Okay, thank you. Like I was saying, it's masked because it cannot be, it's hidden. It's not easily diagnosed. And it's central, meaning that it happens centrally where we don't usually measure hypertension. So it happens in individuals who have normal conventional blood pressure, but elevated central blood pressure. Now, that's why I say this is dangerous, because central blood pressure is more dangerous than the current blood pressure that we are measuring, which is conventional, which is peripheral, because we measure it on the surface. So it means these people, if they walk into your room and you measure their blood pressure, you'll be very impressed. Okay. You'll be impressed and say this person has a normal blood pressure. Meanwhile, this person is walking around with elevated central blood pressure. Hence, I'm saying it is masked. Now, let's see how we are diagnosing blood pressure currently. I'm sure we can all agree that the current diagnostic tool for blood pressure is peripheral blood pressure. And it's most widely used, this method. And I would just like to say right from the start, I'm not saying we should throw this away. It is helping a lot of people because it's currently the main tool for the diagnosis and management of hypertension. As we know that the complications of hypertension are so many, I've just listed a few here. Heart failure, stroke, myocardial infarction, problems with kidneys, stiffening of the arteries, erectile dysfunctions, and retinopathy, just to mention but a few. So that's why the proper diagnosis and management of hypertension is very important. But are we doing a good job so far? Okay. Now, these are the current guidelines that we are using based on the South African Hypertension Society, which says a blood pressure of less than 120, less than 80 is normal. Optimal is 120 to 129. High normal is 130 to 139. Then from 140, it's only when you are starting to talk of hypertension. Now, the American Heart Association and the American Cardiologist Society have actually revised these guidelines. And they say normal is only below 20. Once you reach 120 to 129, it's elevated. And then by the time you say you get at 130, they say you are in stage 1. And so on and so on. So currently, we are not functioning at the point where the American Association is functioning. So what I wanted to do we really need to follow these guidelines of the Americans, or should we stick to the guidelines that we're using currently of 140, diagnosis of hypertension starting at 140? As a researcher, I did some research, recruited participants cross-sectionally. I think I had about 1,300 people and grouped them into groups. TP, that's the total population. Then I had the normotensives, those who were less than 140. The pre-hypertensives, 130 to 139 according to our guidelines, and then from 140 you get your hypertension stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. So I measured all their blood pressures, and the aim was, because the American Society is telling us that what we diagnose as pre-hypertension should be diagnosed as hypertension. So my question is, do people with pre-hypertension present with any organ damage? Should we really bother treating these people or giving them hypertensive medication? And then I looked at pulse wave velocity, which is a measure of arterial stiffness, as we know that this is a predictor of all forms of target organ damage. An increase in pulse wave velocity, which is an increase in arterial stiffness, will lead to heart failure, kidney failure, stroke, and many other problems. Now, as you can see, my people are grouped into 5: normotensive, prehypertensive, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Now, interestingly, for pulse wave velocity, the first bar graph you can see, those are normotensive, so arterial stiffness is very low, which is normal. But you go to the prehypertensive that we currently categorize as normal in South Africa, and you can see that there's increased arterial stiffness there. Already there's damage to the arteries. And by the time you get to stage 1, where we first diagnose hypertension, you can see it's even higher than pre-hypertension. So there's even more damage already. I said, okay, let me just not look at the arteries. Let me look at the heart. What's happening? Left ventricular mass index, which is a measure of left ventricular hypertrophy. And I looked at the normotensive group, normal left ventricular mass. But immediately you get to the prehypertensives and stage 1 hypertensives, you can see that there's an increase in left ventricular mass, and it increases with all the stages of left ventricular mass. Okay. Let me look now at early to late diastolic filling. Now, this is the measure of diastolic heart failure, where the heart stiffens so much that it doesn't relax during diastole to allow normal filling. And this is what leads to heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. Okay, and the lower the E to A ratio, the more the pathology. As you can see, the first bar graph is much higher, meaning that it's fine. But immediately we come to the prehypertensive Scotch, second bar graph, you can see that it has decreased significantly. Now, what's worrying is that in South Africa, we say these people are normotensive. But already we're observing image, the heart stiffening of the ventricle during filling. And you see with stage 1, it gets lower and lower, early to late diastolic filling. So what is this telling us? We need to start by revising our current guidelines. Diagnosing hypertension at 140 is very late. There's a lot of organ damage at that stage when we start diagnosing. So much as the current method we use for diagnosing blood pressure is fine, but we still have a problem that we diagnose hypertension much later when there's already significant damage to the organs. Okay, now let's see if we introduce now 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure. As you know, in South Africa, we're still relying on conventional blood pressure measurement or clinic, the one that we measure in the clinic to diagnose blood pressure. But in the West, in the well-resourced countries, they are now using 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure because it measures blood pressure over a 24-hour period instead of just measuring it once off. And this is helpful because, firstly, if you look at this graph, you've got yellow and you've got what I call orange. I know I'm not good with colors. You may say another color. What you see, the orange part is higher than the yellow part. And if you look, it's the prevalence of uncontrolled blood pressure. So according to the way we are measuring blood pressure, we are showing that there are more people with who are hypertensive and whose blood pressure is uncontrolled compared to when we measure blood pressure using 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure. For instance, in all the participants, it's 37% for conventional, which we are using, but for 24-hour, only 24. Now, even when you take the treated hypertensive, those who are getting treatment, you use conventional, it tells you that 62% still uncontrolled. When you look at ambulatory blood pressure, it says only 33%, which is almost half. Even when you look at all the hypertensives, you can see that it says 81% and 44%. Now, if you remove people with white coat hypertension, now white coat hypertension is the type of hypertension where a person becomes hypertensive as soon as they see the doctor, or as soon as they are aware that you are going to measure their blood pressure, they become hypertensive. But as soon as they walk out of your office, their blood pressure becomes normal. So when we remove those people and look at people who are actually hypertensive, you can see that using conventional blood pressure only, which we are using, we are overestimating people with uncontrolled hypertension. So you find that you even add medication because you're saying blood pressure is uncontrolled because we are using conventional blood pressure. Meanwhile, the person's blood pressure is controlled. So conventional blood pressure measurement has a disadvantage in the sense that there's over-treatment of people who should not even be treated for hypertension. And using 24-hour blood pressure, I discussed this in my last session with you, that we found a condition called isolated nocturnal hypertension, which is those people who only become hypertensive at once they fall asleep, but as soon as they wake up, their blood pressure is normal. And we noted that their arterial stiffness similar to people with full hypertension. So that's another hypertension that we're able to diagnose when we use 24-hour blood pressure. We are also able to see that there are some people whose blood pressure does not dip normally at night. And in our population in South Africa, we have 52% of the population who are non-dippers, whose blood pressure does not drop when they go to bed. And that is a problem. And this can only be diagnosed with 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure. Well, as good as it is, this 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure, which is currently standard in first world countries, there's still a problem because it measures blood pressure at the periphery, at your arteries, which are just in the periphery. So it's not a measure of central blood pressure. So it means, as good as I've shown it to be, still we have not arrived at our destination by using conventional blood pressure measurement. We need to move a step further, where now we measure central blood pressure, and there's technology for that as well. Still not widely used. You've got 24-hour, you can measure 24-hour central blood pressure, can also measure your clinic, which is what we call conventional, which is a once-off measurement of blood pressure. And why is this so important? Central blood pressure is more important than what we are currently measuring, which is the peripheral blood pressure, because that is the actual blood pressure that is experienced by the organs. When we wrap the blood pressure curve on the upper arm and we say we're measuring blood pressure, that's just an estimate. It's not the actual pressure that the brain, the heart, the kidneys are experiencing. The actual pressure they are experiencing is central blood pressure. And research has shown that central blood pressure is more closely associated, is more damaging to the organs of the body than what we are currently measuring as peripheral blood pressure. Though it's still good enough because it gives us an indication, but it is inaccurate. And mainly because of that pulse amplification from the aorta, as you move into the brachial artery, the pulse is amplified. So it's no longer the same pressure that is experienced by the heart or the pressure in the aorta. So the pressures are not the same, the central and the peripheral. Now, if central blood pressure is a better predictor or is more closely associated with those hypertension complications I highlighted, your heart failure, stroke, myocardial infarction, kidney dysfunction, arterial stiffness, erectile disorder, and retinopathy. Now, if central blood pressure predicts this better than the peripheral blood pressure we are currently measuring, what does that tell us? Is this not saying we must shift to central blood pressure and pay more focus on measuring central blood pressure? Okay, now the question arises. If central blood pressure, that's a question that came to my mind, predicts organ damage independent of peripheral blood pressure, do we have a condition that is called masked or isolated central hypertension in South Africa? It means in South Africa, are there people who have normal peripheral blood pressure but elevated central blood pressure? Does such a condition exist? That's a person I said they would walk into your room or clinic or hospital, you measure their blood pressure, whether you use 24-hour or you use the automated device that measures peripheral blood pressure, you will be satisfied that this person is normal. They'll come for monthly checkup or 6-monthly checkup, and you'll be satisfied that this person has normal blood pressure or blood pressure is controlled, only to find that centrally the pressure is uncontrolled and very high. So now, using the current guidelines we're using of hypertension being a blood pressure of greater than 140/90, the current guidelines for central blood pressure, it's blood pressure greater than 125/80. As you can see, because of pulse amplification, the central blood pressures are usually lower than peripheral, meaning that once your central blood pressure reaches 125, you already have central hypertension. So do these individuals exist? Well, I recruited and did what I do best, research, recruited people. Most of my people, I work in the community of Soweto. That's where I do most of my recruitment. And just to say that I do not just recruit, but we sit down with the participants and we explain their results to them, and those who need admission, we make arrangements for them. So we don't just do research and leave people as they are. And we give dietary advice as well. So we measure central blood pressure 24-hour. Okay, we also measure intima media thickness, which is a measure of atherosclerosis in the carotid. We also measure 24-hour, we take 24-hour urine samples to measure microalbumins as an indicator of preclinical kidney dysfunction. We also do echocardiography and electrocardiography to look at cardiac function. Now, these are the 4 types of blood pressure measurements we do. The trusted conventional blood pressure that is currently used all over, the 24-hour blood pressure that is used internationally, where we should be moving as South Africans. And we also use this new technology of 24-hour central blood pressure. And we also measure clinic or conventional central blood pressure. So by the time the people come out of our study, they have 4 types of blood pressures that we measure. Okay, after doing that, then I stratified my population. Normal or acceptable measurements were in about 1,039 people, and I stratified them according to hypertension status. Let me explain. I had those D and T. Now, this is double normotensive. It means they have normal central and normal peripheral blood pressure. And then I have this group, ICH. Those are isolated central hypertensive. It means they have normal peripheral blood pressure, but raised central hypertension. That's my group of interest. So I was sort of glad, in brackets, that this exists in South Africa, so I'll be able to study it. Then there's isolated peripheral hypertension, which is the opposite of isolated central. Now, these people, it means their peripheral blood pressure, when you measure it, the normal way we measure it, they are hypertensive. Their central blood pressure is actually normal. Then I have this group HT. Now these are double hypertensive. So they are hypertensive with both central and peripheral blood pressure. So both centrally and peripherally, they are hypertensive. They are hypertensive. As you can see the results there, the double normotensive, their pressures, whether you look at conventional systolic, diastolic, central systolic, central diastolic is normal. And the isolated central hypertensive, they've got normal, systolic, and diastolic at very high. Look at that, the average is 142, and the normal is 124. So they have extremely high central blood pressures for both systolic and diastolic. And then this group, isolated peripheral, they have increased peripheral, but look at their central, 120, it's normal. Well, as expected, the double hypertensive had the highest values. Average for systolic, 161/96 for peripheral. For central, systolic 151/98. I said, okay, let me look at the different organs, but for the sake of this study, or what I've done so far was just to look at their arterial stiffness. I'm still analyzing some of the data. Just what I discovered is that the incidence of central hypertension is higher than peripheral hypertension in this group. 36 people had central hypertension and only 26% had peripheral hypertension, which is what we measure. And what is this telling us? We should actually be measuring central hypertension because more people of the people have central hypertension than peripheral hypertension, which is what makes this hypertension dangerous, because more people in South Africa have this type of hypertension than what we are currently measuring. So there's this hypertension that is dangerous, that is destroying organs, that we are currently not measuring in people. And we found that amongst what we classify as normotensive individual, actually 14% of those people have central hypertension. So you may diagnose a person in the group of people that you are diagnosing as normotensive. 14% of those people actually suffer from central hypertension, which has been shown to be more dangerous in destroying organs than the current peripheral hypertension we are measuring. Okay. Furthermore, I looked at pulse wave velocity, which is a measure of arterial stiffness, because damage to the blood vessels, it's where most of the problems start in terms of organ damage. Because arterial stiffness is the strongest predictor of hypertension-related organ damage. Now, my question was, do people with central hypertension or with isolated, those with normal peripheral but increased central hypertension, do they have increased arterial stiffness? Or it doesn't matter? If you have central hypertension, as long as your peripheral hypertension is fine, then we don't need to worry. So I said, let me see. And this is what I did. I looked at the relationship between central hypertension and pulse wave velocity, PWV, which is the measure of arterial stiffness. Now, I used the different models. In the first model, as you can see, the R squared value is 55%. I did not correct for anything. Then model 2, I corrected for risk factors that are non-modifiable, like age and gender. And it still persisted, the relationship between central hypertension and arterial stiffness. Model 3, I corrected for modifiable risk factors, which is your obesity, smoking, alcohol intake. So meaning, even after correcting for that, the p-value was still greater than that, was still less than 0.001, meaning a significant relationship. I said, wow, this is interesting. Now let me correct for peripheral blood pressure and see that this relationship exists independent of peripheral blood pressure. Look at that model 4, still sitting at a very significant relationship, meaning that central blood pressure does not depend on peripheral blood pressure in terms of destroying organs. It can destroy your organs even though your central blood pressure, even though your peripheral blood pressure remains normal. The relationship remains significant. This is for systolic and this is for diastolic. For diastolic, as soon as I corrected for peripheral blood pressure, the relationship does not exist, meaning that the problem here is with your systolic blood pressure. And we know that's very problematic. Then now I looked at pulse pressure, central pulse pressure and peripheral pulse pressure, the 3 groups. As you can see, pulse pressure, central pulse pressure is much higher in isolated central hypertension. It's even higher than isolated peripheral hypertension, meaning this third graph, those are your isolated central hypertensive. And these are the people that are diagnosed as normal according to the current method we're using. Look at how high, it's even close to people with hypertension. Even when I look at peripheral pulse pressure, the same remains. As you know, that pulse pressure is also very damaging to organs. And I said, let me look at arterial stiffness. There you can see people who are double normotensive have low arterial stiffness, but isolated peripheral hypertension is also not innocent. As you can see that arterial stiffness, that is the second graph for pulse wave velocity, has significantly increased compared to those with double normotension. And then the isolated central hypertensive is even higher than isolated peripheral hypertension, meaning central blood pressure destroys the blood vessels more than peripheral blood pressure. It's more destructive. And then the last group, those are the double hypertensive. As you can see, that damage to their arteries is the highest. My concern is this the third graph, which we currently categorizing as normotensive. And look at that, they already have significant damage to their arteries. So far with the data I've looked at arterial damage. I'm still going forward to look at the different organs, but that data is not yet available. I'm still analyzing, but just from the knowledge of arterial stiffness, we know that this is a risk factor, a leading risk factor for all of those problems. Hence, we can say that MAST or isolated central hypertension is the most dangerous hypertension phenotype in South Africa because it destroys organs and have found your arteries independent of peripheral hypertension, and its destruction to target organs is more than the destruction that is caused by the peripheral hypertension that we are measuring. On top of that, there are more people with central hypertension than those with peripheral hypertension. So it really means that we must start thinking otherwise and start looking at how we are going to start measuring blood pressure. We need to start incorporating now central blood pressure measurements, especially in South Africa, because it's currently a very serious problem. Thank you. It's time for questions now.
Wow, thank you very much, Prophet. Yeah, no. You, as I said at the beginning, we agree that it was quite a provocative topic that you have about central hypertension, but it's not only provocative, but it's also very scary stuff that you've shared with us about, be walking. I mean, we knew that all along, most people walk around with hypertension, but now the fact is that even those who are hypertensive, they might even do more damage, though they're still seeing their doctor. My first question, before I go to the questions that I see that are posted on the chat box there, how much of collaboration do you have with the clinical departments? I mean, the cardiologists or even the nephrologists, being at the Wits University, maybe Johannesburg, Shadowback Transfer Academic Hospital, because this information, I think there should be quite collaboration between the two, the researcher and also those who are actually seeing patients and also helping them and talking to them about cases that you see they're picking up.
Yes. I'm working very closely with the cardiology division of Charles Macleke Hospital. So I'm working with the head of the department. So I've got cardiologists actually doing these measurements, cardiologists from the hospital. Yes. They do these measurements. So besides this, there are many other studies that I'm collaborating with the hospital. We're also looking at heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, atrial fibrillation in heart failure. So there's a very strong collaboration, and we are publishing together as a group.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure one would have to follow you. I'm sure you must be having just not on the social front, but also following you because you're an academic and an astute researcher to know cutting edge technology that is there in the research work. And I'm quite excited that, when we last spoke to you, you're doing some research and it is ongoing and even now. So maybe you'll get some more participants from this discussion. And I wouldn't mind I wouldn't mind being one of yours. I know that I've been running away from years. It's high time.
Yeah. You're welcome, Dr. Biller.
Yeah. There's a question. I think I like this question because I don't also have issues with the second one. Let me start with the first one, the second one. Raised blood pressure monitors is reliable. I've always had my issues with this one too. The raised blood pressure, the ones that we buy from this scale.
Yeah, no, they are not. They are not reliable at all. You can't use those even for research. They are not accepted. Like I showed you that there's amplification of the pulse pressure. So the blood pressure you are measuring there is even far from the pressure that is actually experienced by the organs.
So you wouldn't encourage the public just to go to DISCAM and monitor, or is it maybe just a way of having a baseline blood pressure?
Yeah, well, you can do it because it gives you an idea, but don't take it as the absolute truth.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Second question related to that: are mercury BP monitors still available at all? The mercury ones, are they still available?
I've never seen a new one because what they do now, they replace the mercury with another liquid because we know mercury is poisonous, and when those things break, they pose serious danger. So I've never seen mercury, but the sphygmanometer and stethoscope are still used, but without the mercury used as something to measure. And as we know, those are more accurate than the electronic ones.
Yeah, sure. From Dr. Pechel, what happens to the peripheral hypertension when you successfully treat central hypertension? For example, symptoms such as the rate of dizziness and syncope that may occur, do you see a reduction in that when you treat your peripheral versus central hypertension?
Or when you treat peripheral and not central?
Yeah.
Or is it when you treat central?
What happens to the peripheral when you treat central? Yeah, so there's a happy baby there. Dr. Mansour, just mute yourself. Thank you. Yeah. The question is, what happens when you do this to peripheral when you treat central hypertension? You're muted, no problem. You're muted.
Okay.
So, yeah.
You say what happens when you treat peripheral, what happens to when you treat central?
When you treat central, what happens to the peripheral hypertension?
In most instances, as you can see, the people with isolated peripheral hypertension, it's just about 1%. So in most cases, when you target central hypertension, your peripheral will be fine.
Yeah.
So if you target central, then you've got it. Your peripheral usually follows central hypertension, but the opposite is not true.
Okay. Yeah. The next question now goes to the vessels. I know we talk about central, peripheral, but now they want to know exactly now. How does the blood pressure differ comparing aortic to radial pressure?
Or aortic compared to radial?
Yeah.
Aortic is much lower than radial, and it has to do with the anatomy of the blood vessel. As we know, the aorta is a very big vessel, and it is very elastic, flexible. As soon as the heart contracts, the aorta is able to increase in diameter and absorb the pressure. But as soon as the blood vessels become smaller and they branch, they become less elastic, and therefore blood pressure increases as you go down to the smaller arteries. So you find that blood pressure in those areas is higher. That's why, as I've indicated, that central blood pressure, which is aortic pressure, is actually normal, is systole of 124. Immediately you get to 125, it's high. Meanwhile, on the periphery in South Africa was sitting at 140. So as you can see, the difference between 125 millimeters of mercury and 140, it's quite big. So the difference, there's amplification of the pressure as you move from the aorta.
Still sticking to central pressure. The question is how I know that you showed us the different gadgets, but how is central pressure measured?
Central blood pressure, the way it's measured directly, it's very invasive because it would involve inserting a catheter on the aorta, and no one would like to go to a doctor to have such an invasive procedure. Now, these gadgets, using that method, they've actually come up with a mathematical transfer function that is able to convert peripheral blood pressure. From that peripheral blood pressure, it can calculate the central blood pressure using that transfer function. So it's more of engineering than anything else. But that has been standardized over and over again and found to be accurate. That's why it's accepted all over the world, even for research. The central blood pressure that is non-invasive, the way we measure it.
Last year, we had one of the speakers, one of your colleagues from the cardiology department, also doing some research also. And they were using artificial intelligence and using that to predict myocardial infarct, heart failure, Any collaboration there, we will comment about that also. Now that you mentioned that, you don't actually measure the central hypertension, but you do mathematical calculations.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's where we are actually moving now. We're moving more towards artificial intelligence, which makes measurements which were dangerous in the past to be much simpler. Even procedures in the hospitals, you'll find that they become less and less invasive as we move towards artificial intelligence. So it's exactly the same thing that this is doing here, that it's actually measuring something that is normally very invasive, but in a non-invasive way using technology. So there is that move towards technology in everything that we do. That's why I would encourage my colleagues to familiarize yourself with technology before you become obsolete.
Yeah, it's very true that the younger generation is quite fortunate because this is their game, bread and butter. They use this quite often. And there's a question I saw sent to me directly. What is hypotension defined as in a patient who's been treated for hypertension?
As you know that it's actually, let's say for a normal adult, you don't want the systolic blood pressure to drop below 100. So once you hit a systolic blood pressure of 90 something and a diastolic blood pressure that is below 60, then you're talking about hypotension. And there's a risk of shock when we go to such low pressures. Yeah. That's why ambulatory blood pressure is very important for proper diagnosis, because you may find that you are actually measuring someone with white coat hypertension. They are nervous because they see you and they become hypertensive, and you put them on medication only to find that they become hypotensive.
Great. I'm going to ask Dr. Tutoi if it's okay with you to unmute yourself. He's a cardiovascular surgeon. He's asking quite, I think the question is quite long, but maybe it's easier when he's asking it. Dr. Tutoi, is that fine? If you can unmute yourself and ask this question. Doc?
Hello, Dr. Bila.
Hi, Dr. Dutoy.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Prof, for a very, very interesting talk. Really enjoyed it. I just have a few questions I'd like to ask you. The first one relates to your measurement of, your pulse wave ratios.
Yeah.
How do you measure them, and how did you standardize them?
Okay, we measure them using the sphygmocord device, something that was designed by the Australians. So what we're simply measuring is the speed of blood flow. So we measure the waveform at the carotid, and then we also measure the waveform at the femoral artery. And we measure the distance between the two using the ECG machine. So we're able to actually calculate the speed of blood flow. Now, what does this tell us? The faster the blood flow, the stiffer the arteries. So if the arteries are stiff and not compliant, so it means blood has to squeeze through very quickly because the arteries have been hardened. Hence, pulse wave, the velocity of blood flow is actually a measure of arterial stiffness. We also use with the same machine what we call the augmentation index. Now, when the heart ejects blood through the aorta, as soon as it reaches the smaller arteries and it starts branching, as you can see there, there's a bit of a congestion and you get a wave, pressure wave that is reflected back to the heart. When it reaches the heart while it's still in systole, it's going to augment. It means increase systolic blood pressure. So we measure that augmentation index. So the stiffer the arteries, the quicker the waveform reaches the heart. In normal individuals, you find that the reflected pressure wave reaches the heart during diastole. So it doesn't augment. Actually, it's good for coronary perfusion. But in stiffer arteries, it's so quick that it reaches the heart while it's still in systole, hence augmenting the systolic blood pressure, meaning that now the heart has to work harder because it's working under higher pressures. And that's why you find that you eventually get hypertrophy, which could lead to heart failure. So that's how we measure it. So it's also non-invasive.
You get lots of questions.
Thank you.
Maybe ask all your questions, Dr. Dutoy.
Yes, I'll do that. Thank you, Dr. Bila. Prof, then also just I have just one or two more questions. What do you think the underlying mechanism or mechanisms are for this, isolated central versus the isolated peripheral hypertension? Do you think it's an endocrine mechanism, or is it an anatomically driven mechanism? So, for example, are the central beds, do they maybe have more exaggerated smooth muscle proliferation as opposed to peripheral? What do you think the mechanism possibly is? Then the other thing just to ask was, did you in your study group identify any risk factors or biomarkers that could suggest that a patient may have or is at risk for developing central hypertension? And then also in your group, did you find that your central hypertensive patients, did they have more sequelae from the hypertension? So i.e. more myocardial infarctions, more strokes, more renal failure, etc. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the first one, what I'm thinking, because as you can see, I'm dealing with a population that has been identified as salt sensitive. In my thinking, that's why I'm collecting 24-hour urine samples. I think we may have a problem with salt, which could be the underlying mechanism leading to the development of central hypertension. That's just how I'm predicting it so far, that salt may be our problem, because salt, besides increasing blood volume and causing blood pressure, it causes direct change in the structure of the arteries themselves. So you may find that the central arteries are actually more affected than the peripheral arteries, maybe due to the way, to the anatomical difference between the two. I've not yet done that. I'm still moving towards that. And also in terms of biomarkers, I have blood samples from all the participants. And from there, I will be able, I may find some novel biomarkers which can help us predict. I'm also suspecting even from the urine, we may find some biomarkers which may just help us by getting a urine sample. We may be able to actually diagnose a patient or predict that the patient is in danger of developing central hypertension. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Joy.
Thank you, Dr.
Professor Maseko is trying to prevent patients from coming to you. We treat them well. They will not get all those complications.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. There is a Professor Varela in our midst. Prof, I don't know if you are able to unmute yourself. Is one of the icons in our medical fraternity. He turned 80 2 weeks ago.
Wow.
Yeah, still around and talking to us and giving advice.
I know him very well.
You should.
Yeah.
Yeah, Prof, any closing remarks that you want to make?
Thank you very much, Dr. Biller. I think that the talk was absolutely fascinating, but the issue that I'm concerned about is how are we going to use this in a practical manner? There's no doubt that the central pressures being high are a problem, and also that that may be due to the actual arterial stiffening. And Dr. Maseko had mentioned that. And I think Dr. Dutoit, what are the mechanisms? Well, what happens is that with this constant stretching of the aorta, there is now there's lots of elastic fibers there. And these elastic fibers, in fact, start fragmenting. And with the fragmentation of that, that gives rise to the very stiff aorta, if you want to call it that. Now, the issue then is that correlates, that stiff vessels, with the systolic blood pressure. And the systolic blood pressure, previously we thought that as we get older, like me now at 80, that the systolic blood pressure goes up, that's normal. When I was a medical student, that is what I was taught. But now we know that it is also a problem, and it can be more problematic than even diastolic pressures. So clearly, the systolic pressure is there. Now, I'm just wondering, and whether Dr. Maseko could, is there a correlation between the systolic blood pressure and the central pressure? And I would suspect that there would be, but I can't say if I've got any data. So that's the first point that I want to make.
Yeah.
Dr. Biller can make one other point too, one or two others. The next one that I want to make is that now that what we now looking at a lot more is masked hypertension. Now, masked hypertension, and they've come out with very interesting sort of criteria to diagnose it. And masked hypertension, when it first was mentioned, is the person comes to your office and the blood pressure is completely normal. But when they're back at home or so, the blood pressure goes up. So, and that's not because he's married or something, it's just that the blood pressure goes up. So the issue then comes out is that how do you pick it up? Now, that was also a problem. But the other point is that, and the things are becoming more and more difficult. You have to do a 24-hour blood pressure recording, an ambulatory blood pressure recording. And if your blood pressure, the daytime average is above 135/85, or the 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure is above 130/80, or the night nocturnal blood pressure is above, I think, 120/80, or 120/70. If those are there, then you've got what is called marked, this masked hypertension. Now, the problem is, what do we do in the clinical setting? We are clinicians. I had a hypertension clinic on a Friday, which had at least 50 patients coming at any one time. And we had to rely on ordinary blood pressure measurements. So, and on the basis of that, we treat it. The data we have is that there is benefit to treating those. So what we don't have now is, first of all, we can't even do at most of our hospitals 24-hour blood pressure recordings. I know that your unit there had quite, you did a lot of 24-hour blood pressure measurements and all that. But again, it's not a practical sort of thing that we can do. So that's the whole problem. And when it comes to trying to diagnose, now it's difficult enough to diagnose masked hypertension as such. But it's a lot more difficult or impossible in a clinical setting where we would be able to sort of pick up whether there is masked central elevation or masked central hypertension. And therefore, the next point will come is when you treat those, will there be benefit? So if we go back to the isolated systolic hypertension studies, whether it's the SHEP study or the one with the Chinese, that showed that if you have isolated systolic hypertension, you treat it and they benefit. So now if you got so one thing I'd just like to ask you, what is there a correlation between isolated systolic hypertension and the masked central hypertension? Whether there is that correlation. But in any case, the work you've done is outstanding. And that's why at every time we went to the hypertension clinic meetings, you were one of the recipients of the various prizes there. So,
thank you, Prof.
And also, by the way, congratulations with your professorship. I hadn't met you for quite a while, so I didn't have to congratulate you. But
we were also in the transformation committee together.
That was years ago, very many years. Remember that. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Prof. You are raising some very important points. The issue of isolated systolic hypertension and the isolated central hypertension, because in a way they are linked. Why? This is age-related. Now, the difference, like I said, there's a difference between central blood pressure and peripheral. But you find that as you age, the difference between the two pressures become less. And the older you become, you reach a point where your central actually becomes higher than your peripheral blood pressure because of the stiffening of the aorta, which is age-induced. So there is that link. That's why you find that, as I've shown, the problems are mainly with systolic blood pressure. Hence, you find that the increase with age is mainly on systolic blood pressure, leading to the increase in pulse pressure, as I've shown in my results, that actually isolated central hypertension is linked to pulse pressure. And isolated systolic hypertension is also driven by the pulse pressure difference. So the two conditions are linked. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, thank you very much. But the study is a fascinating study, and thank you for coming over. And I think that it's a very difficult topic, very difficult topic.
It is.
But I think that you put it across very nicely. The only thing, I'm a clinician by heart, and I would find that it seems that we're still far away from how this concept will become something close to or comes down into a clinical environment.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for your.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much, Prof.
Thanks a lot, Prof. Forever, and quite nice comments and accolades for Professor Maseko, that you are amongst the legends and giants in the medical academic research in clinical medicine, and you, as he says, you're one of the recipients of the awards from time to time, and we want to congratulate you. And we just want to thank you for making time to be with us. And I think the colleagues are just saying that it's just a pleasure, to have you to talk to us. And there's Dr. Van der Walt says, Professor Maseko, Dr. Bila Clinics, Professor Vareva, Cynthia, thanks for this important presentation that you've made. And we truly have gained a lot. And I think cutting edge research that you're working on, and we wish you all the best. And we, as Prof says, Vareva, that some of the information that you're bringing in, it's something that will come in later in the clinical setting, because as researchers, you look ahead and you see things from afar, and you utilize your informed clinical practice at the same time. So on behalf of clinics, I just want to say thank you once more for availing yourself, and we know that please, when we call you again, please don't hesitate to say yes.
Yeah.
And to the colleagues and the partner that you're working with, we just want to say thank you very much. And also to the team that is here, thank you very much, colleagues, for joining us. Quite a good number that was joining us, one of the highest attendances that we had this year. And it shows that this is an interesting topic, and also quite an eloquent speaker that we've had. We also want to thank the team that I work with from clinics, marketing division, for putting together this presentation. And we say thank you, and we wish you a good night, and we'll see you again next week when we have another speaker. Thank you very much. God bless you.